Sharpa Adu So Inam Gurana Mandala Gani Atayami Sanje Cheta Zoji Chana La Chanchu Padu Dani Jaso Tagui Chijin Jive Sonam Ji Androla Benji Sanje Shu Sanje Cheta Zoji Chana La Chanchu Padu Dani Jaso Tagui Chijin Jive Sonam Ji Androla Benji Sanje Andro Shu Sanje Cheta Zoji Chana La Chanchu Padu Dani Jaso Tagui Chijin Jive Sonam Ji Androla Benji Sanje Ruba Shu Latana Memedam Jion Bodan Jena So Chujala Chava Chavona Sanje Parado Chiji Deve Teta Chiji the Bechini de She Deve Jin Derin Sanje Cheva de la Churu Tajin Go Yen de la Benja Sujan Betone Levato La Tuve Sonye Namo La Ega Dan Nijinga Tribuna da Me Kanam Dan Drova Kumenji Danan Chiza Batam Jaka Do Dagi Cheto 강경호 대전은 오메 반지서 이신임의 삼매자 뱀매대 라차자로 야다 갈소리 러리시면아 갈소리 마리비 린도기 밀팀네스 아니 가서를 동화단 대화를 준비 치질로그 리베스 아니 동화 지지라 아니 윤된다니 동화 자서 딜라타 남바군도 예매지 치지 친이 친와라 지바치다 제민주로 전에 어디다 소화해 봐라 에 가르에서나 땅 알아서 랑도진내라 몽베기 아니 마리바기 아니 가서를 밀티반 드림니 랑도진 옛날식의 밀티니 드림니 아니 동아란 데라 쳔베 데라 쳔바기 아니 다 치질로 시그나네 동아란 데라 쳔바 뭐 동아 예바라 아니 콘 데라 안딘도 시 대셔네 아니 디시데 텐데위 데와스 비치도 아니 레사디 레사와라 데네 아니 레지 아미지 데우 아니 다 파샤 거디 아니 거기 저와 주박이 아니 동아기 때 거기 저와 주박 제바인장 아니 대순거를 마리비 동아라 대화 전부 시기로 그 리베스 동아 자손 딜라니 남바군도 타에 메데스 동아 자손 세데다 사제니리지 풍보 여등아란 사제니리지 풍보 딜라 남바군도 타요와 마레스 라 타세데 타이 아니 가서에 타니 세단 죽자단 내다 쳐다 매발라오 세가라다 세발라 다 세바지와 말이 차 주다 마보여 하래요 나뭐 동안 자주 딜라니 나바군도 담임에대지 지지친이 친와라 지바친이 지민주로시 랑도지 내라 몽벽이 안에 치와 말안 좋다고 아니 어텐다위 동아이 자주 칭시와니 아니 레다니 몽그 샤완도 주고 풍부되게 와서 주네 레이가 완도 주고 풍부되라 어선거에 말에 어디 아니 지바지단 친민주로서 다들 지바지단 친민주로서 가라 풍부될 신제라 다 가상 가능 가상 시와나시 자지 아니 동아제라실에 맞아와 야
So now, as it says in the great treatise on the stages of the path, we ordinary beings are as if blinded, or actually our vision is obscured by cataracts of ignorance. And because of these cataracts of ignorance on our eye, the eye of our intellect, therefore, because of that defect in our vision, we see that which is actually of the nature of suffering as if it was pleasurable. And we make that sort of erroneous judgment that things that are actually have as their very nature suffering are in fact pleasurable. And because of this misconception that they're pleasurable, then we grasp at them, we pursue pleasure, and we try to find happiness in that which is actually entirely pervaded by a suffering character or nature. And because of that ignorance, which has completely covered our intellect and prevented us from seeing things as they actually are, that is, things that are of the nature of suffering as suffering, misconceiving them as being pleasurable, striving to attain them. And when we do that, we engage in all kinds of karma. The activity of pursuing pleasure, then that action itself kind of like stains our mind stream. The stream of our mind is it's like it's covered over with a kind of the karmic stains and stain of that activity, and then that karmic stain in turn serves as a propensity which in the future, when conditions are right, will produce more suffering in the future. And so that initial state of being blinded by the cataract of ignorance and pursuing pleasure in that which is actually of the nature of suffering then causes us to fall into the ocean of samsara. The ocean of samsara is actually, really, it's not an external thing, it's the aggregates that we take up by the force of contaminated karma and mental affliction. That is the samsara, the body-mind complex that we have appropriated through the force of contaminated karma and mental affliction. And that ocean of samsara, and within the ocean of samsara, these contaminated aggregates that we've taken up, we suffer endlessly. There's no beginning to this process of suffering, no end to it. And the metaphor of the ocean there is that it's inexhaustible. There's no end to it as long as we're under the control of contaminated karma and mental affliction. So thus, in that sort of state, as long as from the moment we take up these contaminated aggregates, which are produced by karma and mental affliction, then from that moment on, henceforth, we suffer inevitably within the ocean of samsaric existence, which is endless. There are different ways of reading, understanding the word endless here, meaning limitless in terms of duration or space, but we can take it in terms of inexhaustibility, that the ocean of samsara is inexhaustible as long as one is dominated by this basic misconception of the way things exist, and particularly grasping at that which is suffering as if it was pleasurable.
Oh yeah, 사제기 초안 대화 대다 안에 누가 치치해봐라 원래 처음 나신 이전에 누가 치치해봐라 대화는 거 맞점 좀 해봐라 하신지 대화 짜니 매봐 라신지 대화 다 분보들이 치제라 땅아지 라신은 대화 치제 좀 해봐인자 안에 분보들이 사제기는 이 분보들이 가봐라 타 세바지 여와라 안에 뒤 주봉괴 누가 안에 내다니 뭐니 배 나 아니 가서래 가서 니모 마바 가서래 자와 내인이가 나냐 나나장 아니 니모 저쪽에 가래래 해서나 아니 니모에 봐 니모 매면 매나 아니 레지나미지도 판민도 봐 어디와 어디 시베스라 남가지 레신 편는 많이 돼 현지 제바 사실로 소환하시 전에 아니 니몽기 가서 현지 제재 내리면 현지 제바 사로 세가나 어디 소환하시 전에 니몽면나 레그나미도 평밤하고 밤면이 봐 날 니몽 봐와라 아니 가르래서 니몽그 잡아다 되니 된다 고도 시아바 나시 제리 치질로게 로테다게 자와 카와 투고레 세라가다 마리벨용도게 미키와 세가가 랑도진나라면 마리바도 봐주고와 마리바도 봐셔봐라 아니 다음에 마리베기 아니 가서를 마리방에 쓰용봐 마리방에 쓰용해 쓰네 아니 가자랑시 메가바게 아니 동반이 때라 바고와 다 들리는 말에
So now then, when we're cycling in samsara, and we've sunk into the ocean of samsaric existence that has taken up these aggregates due to the force of karma and mental affliction, then that suffering is limitless, is inexhaustible, in the sense that as long as one is dominated by the mental afflictions and the karma that's induced by mental affliction, when there's no end to the process of suffering, samsaric existence is inexhaustible in that way. And within the different forms of erroneous thinking, erroneous understanding that give rise to samsara, a relatively coarse form, but one that is extremely powerful, is misapprehending pleasurable, contaminated pleasurable sensations as if they were true pleasure or true happiness. And this will come later on, be explained later on in the text that we're studying, where it demonstrates that what worldly beings construe as being pleasurable is actually pervaded by a basic character of being suffering. It's a misconception that misconstrues pleasurable, contaminated pleasurable sensations as if they were actually happiness or pleasure. So we'll see then that there's no real pleasure in samsara, even though worldly beings perceive things as if they were pleasurable. That's a basic mistake. Now, we said that there's no exhaustion of samsara as long as one wanders within it under the force of karma and mental affliction. But the way it is exhaustible, samsara can be ceased because the basic causes that give rise to it are removable, can be eliminated. As we said, then samsara as such is the aggregates, contaminated aggregates, which are produced by mental affliction and contaminated karma. And by removing the cause of the aggregates, which are themselves samsara, then samsara itself is ceased, comes to an end. And the way in which we can do that is by eliminating that cause. The effect itself is difficult to remove. You can't remove the effect as such without eliminating the cause that gives rise to it. And the primary cause here is mental affliction and contaminated karma, which is motivated by mental affliction. Within those two, the primary source of the suffering, the actual cataracts which obscure our intellect or our understanding of the way things are, is the misconception which grasps at things as being real. At the very root of samsara is this misunderstanding of things which don't exist by means of their own intrinsic nature, that don't possess any kind of essence or intrinsic nature at all. We misperceive them as if they possessed intrinsic nature, or as if they existed by means of their own intrinsic character. So that basic misconception is ignorance, what is defined as ignorance, which is the foundation of the entire samsaric process as it's laid out in the 12 factors of dependent origination. And in order to stop that samsaric process, one necessarily has to remove that ignorance. The only way to do that is by, first of all, identifying ignorance as ignorance, understanding what it is, and then the only way to remove it is to eliminate, by understanding through rational investigation, that the conceived object of ignorance, the intrinsic nature or intrinsic existence of things, is actually completely non-existent. By recognition, through analysis and rational investigation, understanding that the object of ignorance is non-existent, then one can see that ignorance itself is erroneous, and one can eliminate it through eventually understanding emptiness, which is the contrary and antidote to the misconception that things exist by means of their own intrinsic nature.
Oh yeah, that 가르쳐오래 구바 탐색에 싸와 안에 단체 말이 봐 결라 때네 안에 치지로 그 저바들이 용어가 인상 안에 싸와 단체 말이 봐라 총바 인상 가서는 지된 구바 신에 봐 태이 싸와 말이 돼서 가시 통해 대조 받던지 저와 중화송 소송아 나신 이전에 안에 텐더위 말이 봐로 치지로 티 안에 진주 따라 매봐 리베 땅아 팝디 텐더위 안에 동방 오심도 동방인 아니 오심도 또비 이시대 아니 가서래 동바 때나 탑대 대라를 마신도 고밀이 아니 무슨 또 이시께니 대나를 마신도 아니 그 바다 탐제자 자 말이밥 아니 뻥거 도시전에 두고 와래 대대인 발라다 니군 탐제자 자와 세와 니군 탐제자 자와 임바 세와 제발라야 아니 내가 들을 때네 말이 발라 때네 아니 가서래 치질로 그때 바다 계속 텔라 때네 아니 텔레사소 레디 왕게 아니 풍부디 춤네 아니 동아 나주든서 마 시제니 아니 동아라 밑에별로 마제 봐도 아니 동아라 본다고 지그 말이 대장원라 아니 동아 시니 아니 동아 삼네 아니 동아랑 내와 저거 로디 지고 연장 동아 시위 연된데라 아니 동아랑 내와 지와 강 동아랑 내와 지위 내중 지와다 지바세와다 중주로서 말이야 동아 연된이 저 지바세와지 코아발라 인제 제와야 동아라 삼발라 때네 지고와 랑 동아라 미디빙 내중 제와야 동아라 때네 동아 삼발라 때네 지고와 아니 가서 저 지바세와 딜라 셈신 gel라 가세 아니 동아 삼바인자 아니 동아 메데다 동아 그 주방고와 인자 아니 미거와 뽕와라야 잡아 개와 주바라 잡아야 다투생고와 인자 아니 동아 시와자 다땡라 바바데 개시요인 바레
So then, if we think about it carefully, we can, as it says in many places, that the root of all of our troubles, all of the misfortunes and suffering that we experience within samsara, is this ignorance, the misconception of things as existing by means of their own intrinsic nature. And in order to eliminate that, an elimination of that ignorance is the only method by which one can achieve freedom from those misfortunes of samsara, the troubles, all the difficulties that we experience, all the suffering that we undergo within samsara. So we need to first identify what that ignorance is, how it operates, how ignorance functions as a foundation for all of the other kinds of misconceptions, erroneous ideas that we have about the way things are, such as grasping at that which is actually of the nature of suffering as being pleasurable. And in particular, we need to understand how ignorance as the fundamental error that gives rise to erroneous forms of understanding the world, and then based on all the other forms, erroneous ideas about the world, we engage in all kinds of faulty behavior, do negative karma, negative actions that induce us to undergo experience over and over again throughout the process of samsara. So it's the initial identification of ignorance and the elimination of it that we need to do by means of establishing properly what emptiness is. Emptiness meaning the absence of intrinsic nature of things, and which is the contrary of the fictitious object, which is conceived by the misconception that things are real. So once we've done that sort of process of identification, we can see how all of the other kinds of erroneous ideas about that which is of the nature of suffering, holding it to be pleasurable, holding things which are impermanent as if they were impermanent and so forth, as it's being explained in this text, we'll see how those arise out of that fundamental ignorance. And then once we've come to understand in turn that all of the different kinds of misfortune and suffering that we experience arise from this basic source, then we'll develop gradually by understanding suffering itself properly, we'll develop a strong wish to become free from the suffering condition, and that will induce us to develop renunciation of samsara, a kind of revulsion towards the entire complex of being embedded in samsara. And then once we have done that, in order to do that, we first of all have to understand suffering properly, whereas worldly beings misconstrue the nature of suffering and don't understand it at all. Once we understand it properly, then we'll develop revulsion towards suffering as it actually is. And that in turn can serve as a foundation for developing compassion towards others. When we understand our own suffering correctly and develop a revulsion towards our actual suffering nature, then we'll be in a position to be able to understand other people, other beings' suffering as it actually is, and then we can develop compassion towards them and the rest of the path to the achievement of Buddhahood. All of this is rooted in a correct understanding of what suffering actually is and the development of a revulsion towards the actual condition of suffering.
Oh yeah, then that the Shijuloshi Nane, Anita Kasore, Dungana Davarsimbi, Yambo Dunga Comete, Tatama Kasan, Masha, that is Koro, such a Koro. So what Chimbo, Muguma, Dunga Junga, Lava, Dirwa. No, oh, that's all Chimbo Muguma, Dunga Jungla, Sambala, Dawa Kombala, Mene, maybe any Yebi, Dunga, Chiribatang. Chabela Ku and Dala Kua, that Sumba Tamba, Yinane. That Tambo Dunga Kombala, Mene, maybe Dunga Chiribani said, this is Dunga Debe Nijuji. Dunga Debe Nijuji, Deba Dewa Kalai. Chichu Gomba La Guishin, Mela Castle, Gidi Chimichi, no Digi Gana Carson with the Esana, Dungani, Tatu Nyawatang. Me young Bebe to Mugoba, Dunga Tatu Nyawata, me young Dunga Bebe to Mugoba, Debes. To Mugoba, and the bottom Jenny, Debe never touches. Debe Deva never color in the bottom, Deva never color in the Dunga Change Lula and the Commission.
So then, thus, what we're discussing here is understanding the four forms of erroneous belief or ideas. The idea that which is, we talked in the first chapter about the erroneous belief in that which is impermanent, as if it were permanent, and then now we're dealing with the erroneous belief that which is of the nature of suffering is actually happiness or pleasurable. And so there's an analysis here of that demonstrates that that which is of the nature of suffering is not real pleasure or real happiness. And we've led us to the second one of the second topics in this chapter, which is that how we should think about how easy it is for suffering to arise without needing any great effort at all, that it occurs easily. And then the first topic here is that if one considers happiness to be and pleasure to be rare, then one ought to be, it's appropriate for one to be frightened of suffering, which is extremely plentiful. And this is explained in the verse 30 of this chapter of the text. So here it says, "Suffering is found at will, but what pleasure is there at will?" Meaning, what pleasure is easily found. Why do you value the rare, but do not fear the plentiful? And so here it says that suffering is always close by, and even if it's not nearby, it can be found at will without the need of effort to acquire it. But what pleasure is actually found at will or easily?
Oh yeah. That deep is la, Ninja Tower Compassion, you may tower della, and travel reach a compassion, Ninja Tower Compassion. Chichi Comba Lea Gushin, Yola Chiti Chimichis, Millionaire, Yamado Santo, I tend to call it Della Mercy today. Chidemba Chi, Juchi, the Wakambala Cushing, Juchi, and the Wakambala Cushing. Dunga Yobala Cheki the Missy days, Dunga Yobayana, Delcado.
Muba,
Meba I am Hamoko, Dunga Yobaloche, Yaba Mandrosa, that
the Mangway Yoruba, Muba son of Mangwa.
망와라 전적으로 동아 망와라 전에 저거 동아 여바다 망와 동아 망와라 여바 망와라 지的미지대 미지비 최지 미지비 대비 대와 관바라 지지 최 미지 대비 대와 관바라 그거를 채나 미대비 동아 안에 가서라 망와 아니 여바라 이중아 그래서
So then, the example that's given to illustrate this is the way in which is rare as finding what pleasure can be found when just wants it without any effort at all. It is extremely rare for us our bodies which are of the nature of suffering, and it is rare as finding coolness in the sun's heat. That being the case, why do ordinary people value pleasure, which is rare, but do not fear suffering, which is plentiful? If you value that which is rare, the rare and desired suffering, it is appropriate to feel aversion for undesired and plentiful suffering.
Oh yeah. 랑데 전지 랑데지 동아지 대화 메도 바신도 저변안에 랑구 대화 나신전이 아니 동아전지 아니 대화 메도 바신어스.
So the example that's given to illustrate this is like some man who got into a king's treasury, and though he, out of his own desire, he snuck into the treasury, but what he got was nothing but suffering. He thought that he was going to get happiness, but out of his own wish, he achieved nothing but a form of suffering.
Oh yeah, that didn't Chabelula Kuan Drala Kua da Sumba Dampatela. The other Liboni Dungane to Chuate. Lula Kudan Drala Kui Tadani Sumba Nang Sedra. Or the Lu Sha Janla, or Lord Semejan, Dunga Chambo Jabatar. Joseph Dorothy Liboni, and it Dunga Chimbo to Chuate.
So this leads into the next topic, next verse, which says that a comfortable body is a container of suffering, thus valuing the body and valuing an enemy or foe both seem similar. Since it's the case that even a thorn can cause the body with its delicate flesh great suffering, even a somewhat comfortable body is actually a container of great suffering.
Oh yeah. 아니 된다 되게 가서래 류라 쿠단 드라라 고 대단히 손바나 세세 가사 되게 랑기 류라 쿠와 차와단 드라라 쿠와 차바니 손바네데 드라되게 랑라 동아 깨바나시 아니 류테야라 동아다 깨 류라데네 깨바이네 가상하게 류는 드라다 톰매장 세나시 제수인지리 가사디 류라 쿠와단 드라라 쿠와 대단히 손바나데 동아지규 드바다위시로
So the person that thinks that way, they value their body, but they don't desire any kind of suffering, is like somebody who has respect for their and admires their enemy. The two are equal, appear to be similar, because both of them, the body and an external enemy, are included within the causes of suffering for that person.
자유 통반에 대인지 레버 장배 아니 용가지 주지기 리배장 이민에 봤어 이민에 봤다고 용가지 주지 이민에 봐 좋아다 대외 요새 치다 담바타다 동아지네도 좀 롱도 줄었어.
So for the example here that's given is that once there was a man who was sleeping in a chariot, and a king saw him and felt a great deal of compassion for that man for having to sleep out in the chariot, and so he took care of the man, pampered him, and then once that man had become so accustomed to comfort and pleasure, then even when he touched even a grain grain of mustard, then he wasn't able to sleep after that, even though he had slept previously in a chariot. And so someone is like that. Things, when we indulge ourselves in pleasure, these things that we consider to be pleasurable to us, the more that we sort of indulge in them, then they become actually the sources of our own suffering.
Oh yeah, that is you do not get a mother or somebody. Lini Shindu Govajang, the Watani Minjuti, Rashi Senji Suni, Chawariba Maino, say, oh, that's Luni is a Shan Luni, Rumbo David, Urumbo, and David Guru is and David Guru, Longi Jandis, Shindu Govajang, Turumbo Govajang, David out to Minjuti, David out to Minjuti, and Dumaji Jan Mister.
Next shows the way in which the body is how we should think about our bodies as having nothing but a nature of the nature of suffering, and this is explained in verse 32, which the body, however long one spins, will not in itself become pleasurable. To say its nature can be overruled by other factors is incorrect or improper. Whose natures can be overruled or can be actually overcome by other factors is illogical or incorrect. So, moreover, even if one cossets the body for a long time with comforts intended to cause pleasure, however long one spins, the body will not in itself become pleasurable because its nature is suffering. To say that its nature can be overcome by other external factors is incorrect.
Oh yeah,
that nature, the nature itself of the body is suffering. So to say that nature of it can be overwhelmed by external factors that are not natural to it, is incorrect.
That's could you get to Charoki system Jang or could you corner in by Guji, Charo member Tishindu, Li David Ranshin to Debayang, and then Tetan.
So here then the example that's given, somebody who thinks that that imagines that the body can they accept it as having a pleasurable nature is like the example that's given to illustrate this is when a parrot raises a fledgling parrot is raised by a crow. The crow might take care of that parrot chick, but it will always have that nature. It'll be a parrot, no matter how much it's been nurtured by the crow.
Oh yeah, Devi Ranshin to Debaya, Tetan Trasa, Ludumaji Ranshin, to Devi Ranshin to Debaya, Tetan Travarese. That do not never choose Sambatella. Oh, Tanam to the toilet, Chola Yiji Dungadi, Tamanamla Lujeso. Dungan Yiji, then the Nirishin to Jambache, Segala. That Chola Yiji Dungache, Sekadi Jarila Sova Jene. And Mashipado saw and there were Canada Damba Tonwe Dungaji Rashin, but Miris of Shana. Oh, Jarila saw Jane and Mashidi Pato launch a prison saw Canada Damba Yim, Tamimbe saw there were Canada Damba Tonwe Dungaji Rashin, but Miris of Shanas. Kodan launch chamber than Dembi Jawala saw a chore. Rangi Pinzo Nyamtoba, Rangi Pinzo Sawa, Nyamtoba, Shanji Pinzo, la Mississippi, Yiji Dunga, Dungatam, Gundu, Dungata, Gundu Deji, Gundu Dandes, De Chola Yiji Dunga de Tamawala Lujiso, Seganam, and Yoji Pombi, Tamawala Choa Dunga. Ani lula jeba. 다 소환이 이지 그 가서래 이미대당 아니 뉴스대와니 그 가나 심지 아니 동아 이미대대 자우든 이래다 된 거라 타마와라 이지소세 초라 이지 동아대 세대라 이미대세 타마와라 이지세세 가나 아니 뉴스 동아.
So then you might think, well, those who are born as aristocrats and so forth of high status, from the time they're born until they die, they just experience pleasure. They have pleasurable sensations throughout their life. We can see that. Therefore, having a body is not necessarily, it's incorrect to say that the body has as its very nature suffering sort of character. If you say that, then the verse here, verse 33 says that the superior persons have a mental suffering, and lowly persons have suffering which arises directly from their bodies. These two kinds of this world, which is the world here means. The sentient beings in particular that inhabit the world are destroyed day by day by these two forms of suffering, that is the mental suffering and physical suffering. So the explanation of this is that that's incorrect, that superior persons, people of high status, kings, others, aristocrats, people of that nature, even though they possess incredible entourages of attendants and so forth, and they have a great deal of wealth, they're always worried about losing their own wealth. And then also they have mental suffering that arises from jealousy because of seeing the wealth of others. They're unbearable mental suffering that arises from that constantly. They're constantly concerned with losing their wealth or jealous of the wealth of others. And then for low-born people with low status in society, they experience the suffering of being deprived of the necessities of life, and they undergo the sensations of suffering that are physical in nature, that arise directly out of their bodies. And so therefore, that being the case, then this world, the world of and the beings that inhabit it, is constantly, every day, destroyed and harmed by the two forms of suffering, the bodily suffering and mental suffering.
Oh, yeah. Jena 가서 lonje 피순 소와단 소와 치점 채와 젠tam기 안에 동아양치 대 이지 동아 채와데 다시는 가서 송와다 지대하고 조금도 고데 루저 남나 고치니에 봐 대래층 동아 대니에 도세 루남나 고치 고망보 치니에 봐 대신도 안 동아야 대니에 도세 이서와 나시 전에 lonje단 반주 치점 채와 대tam기 안에 동아야 대장 요바데 다 송고엔 바래.
So there's it's explained likewise in the Precious Garland that people who are born into high status positions with wealth and power, it seems like they're happy, but when you look at them carefully, as much wealth and power as they have, that actually produces the mental suffering, increases it to the extent that they have that wealth and power. And then, of course, for the people that don't have any wealth and no power, then they suffer physically in various ways. This is explained likewise in the this point here is demonstrating the a point which Master Nagarjuna has made in the Precious Garland as well.
Oh yeah, that one is 직된데 일이 좀 받체 세가나 안에 류소 멤버남들 류소 동화당 안 초라 섬조대 안에 섬조 동화 섬조 다 이미 되었대. 텐자위 류소 동화당 이미 된 얘기 동화 얘기 직된데 일이 신도 안에 좀 받쳐 봐. 배나 겨우 랑보라 깨미 아니 아니 랑보지 도제라 캐와 가와당 대통령의 랑보체라 왕치비 대통령의 랑보체라 왕치비 미대와당 미가와 자유 체바당 자위 샤바단 제외 류의 동안 와시노 미가와의 자위 샤바단 제외 아니 류의 동안 와시노.
So thus, if we think of it that way, this world that we're living in, with high and low people, people of high status and low status, is destroyed day in and day out, every day, by these two forms of suffering. High status people, even if their bodies are relatively comfortable, undergo intense mental suffering of jealousy and worry. And then the low people with no wealth, no power, they suffer through the physical sufferings of hunger and thirst and so forth. And so it works like that. And then the example that is given to illustrate this is there was a king who greatly admired someone who had skill in taming elephants, was able to ride on the elephants and train them very easily. And when some other man who was actually in charge of the elephants, the master of the elephants, saw that other man being admired by the king, he suffered mental anguish at seeing that. And then there was another man there who had no skill at all. He wasn't able to control the elephants properly, and the king punished him physically. He beat him as a result of that.
Oh yeah, 당하와 동아 체도보단 담바 삼바니스. 내가 또바기 나대 당 주세요. 이사 말할 때 왕은 주지만도 상도. 내가 또배 왕은 주지. 네 간도.
The Wangu.
Yeah, the Wang Chuji said that. There were Toba Tanchu said, there were Toba Wang Chuji, Toba Dunga Wang Churwa. Teju Guna Dunga La Shindu to the Chiang May said that did him, but I didn't cast it. Oh, yeah. 想啊，是真的。他看的东啊，你绿色东啊当，什么时东啊，因为台湾你越没去，他当那样，俺那台湾全部给，俺那十几年呗，没些说些那是啊。
So this leads to the next topic, which is how we should think that suffering is extremely powerful. And this is explained in verse 34, where it says that pleasure is governed by thoughts, thoughts are governed by pain or suffering. Thus there is nothing anywhere more powerful than suffering or pain. The translation here could be altered a little bit and say that that pleasure or happiness is controlled by thought, and thought arises from suffering and is controlled by suffering. Therefore, in all cases, there's nothing at all which is more powerful than suffering.
Oh yeah,
and this is someone might say, well, it is the case that there are those two forms of suffering. There's mental suffering and physical suffering, but even though that is so, then isn't it these sufferings can be overcome by great pleasure, and therefore it is the case that there is real pleasure to be found.
我这啦是，没些说些那是，东岸十几年里面台湾全部没得是，东岸十几年前面台湾全部没得是，台湾多别往的出去是干呐，台湾你东岸就往的去，多把拉拉来话的是吧？多把拉拉来的，你当你多往不让把说起，一台湾穷呢，一台几万人，一台湾穷那是。 然体就那样，就把越讲，就把的军械机拖把给，俺那多把一直在我多把就来，俺这俺那看说了，一直在我穷话的，就把越讲，就把的军械机拖把，俺这一直在我的多把就啊。 在我计划上，搞把多比往多，在我计划上，在我搞把的多比往多出现，在我里边多把东亚去，俺那准备 동아지 왕도 주와 태치
So the reasoning that explains this, how it is.
태치에서야 괜찮아 가서 대외 뒤에 또봐 동아지 준비 동아지 왕도 주가 주와이 티 굉장히 태치 지금 꽤나 동아래 시도도 단대배 대바지야 말에
So here then, someone might think, well, there is great pleasure that can overcome suffering, so there is pleasure to be found in the world, happiness in worldly existence. However, the response to that is that there is no pleasure, even the greatest of pleasures, that's able to overcome suffering entirely. Happiness or pleasure depends upon thought, which is actually controlled by suffering. And it's explained as follows, illustrated as follows, like this. When you think, oh, I'm a benefactor, I'm giving things away. And by giving things away, you give rise to some pleasure in your mind, mental sensation of pleasure. And however, as soon as that occurs, then you come to think, oh, but if I give all this stuff away, then even though I have a lot of stuff, a lot of wealth, then I might lose all of my possessions, might be exhausted. I might lose all of the wealth that I've accumulated by giving it away. So that thought, which is worry about loss of your wealth, even when you're thinking sort of proud that you're a benefactor and giving it away, then that thought causes the reversal of that initial mental happiness that you had at being a benefactor. And so we can see from that the arising of happiness and its cessation occurs under the control of thought. And since it's the case that a thought which is So even the thought which is included within happiness, when we're thinking, oh, I'm a benefactor, how nice, that can be, since that's destroyed by suffering, the worry of losing all of your possessions by giving them away, then it's under the control of suffering, and therefore in the world, in all respects, there's not even a single sensation of pleasure which is more powerful than suffering, that is able to overcome suffering entirely.
Oh yeah. 信徒都在讲没，现在大家，信徒都在这边说话对话讲没头，别呢，千军你来，比较经济了，千军你来，这个人个不喜欢来，就是去普了过啊，东啊吃话西喏是，然后，人个不喜欢来，就是去普了，现在按照古地吃话的东啊吃话西喏。
We see an example of this, which is illustrated, is that there was a case when there were two wives, a senior wife and a junior wife, and the senior wife's son died, and the junior wife's son was elevated to a position of respect, and the senior wife felt more suffering upon seeing the elevation of her rival's son to a position of respect than she felt at even at the suffering that she felt on the death of her own son. So therefore, that kind of great suffering occurs in situations like that.
Oh yeah, that 주바 류지 초와 주바 초원 대와 류지 전부 따라 초원 대와 류지 전부 나신 전부 따라 삼바니 시다 뒤조와 대다 동아패 대진 대와 류디 전부다 보나와 주로 어디기 대와 녀가양 아니 레바 미시비시라 레바 미시비치 류지랑신 이라스 동아 마야랑 내가 제배 리지 셴바다고 이노 셴나.
So then the next verse shows that pleasurable sensations are similar to a visitor within our bodies, and how to think about that. This is the next topic. And then if we think about it as follows, that as time goes on, suffering increases. Therefore, pleasure within our body, or happiness, physical pleasure, is similar to a visitor, or that is an alien, something which is other than the body. And then someone might object to this sort of line of reasoning and say that even though pleasure is difficult to attain, it doesn't harm. There's no harm in it. It doesn't. It's not harmful, and it's actually of the nature of the body. Sorry, I mistranslated that. Let me start over here. Where is that? 35. Although pleasure is hard to find, it does no harm. But since pain harms, it is as if alien to the body. The response to that is that pleasurable sensations are not natural to the body. For with the passage of time, I'm sorry, we haven't done that yet. So, well,
Oh, yeah. That got a whole that Chita Tujoa, Teta Dunga Pe said, so and there were the Lugeras Mares. Maimba Gares and Chiwadang, Shunudan, Talababatan. There was so Chita Tujo, there was so Chita Tujoa. Teta, there was a Dunga Pelas at the Bashin to any Dunga Bashin pay versus Talaba. There was a Dunga Pelas. There were Jamne Chevas and Jamne Jojoa. There were Jamne Cheva teacher, Jamne Drova teacher. There were Ludi Shambo, Sharatam. Jobi Jomota Bures, or Lady Shambo Shared and Jobi Jomota Punavishiro.
So the response to that is that pleasurable sensations are not natural to the body. Our bodies don't naturally have pleasurable sensations, and the reason for that is that as we proceed, as we go through the course of our lives, from childhood to becoming youths, to full maturity, to old age, as the time goes on over the course of our lives, we can see that the suffering of aging, of becoming old and so forth, increases as time goes on, and that whatever ephemeral pleasure we had early on actually disappears behind us as we proceed through the course of our lives. Therefore, pleasure is alien to the bodies that we possess, and it lasts for a single day, but it appears actually as if it's just a visitor who stays for a single night.
Oh yeah, that is bela. Lam rimbo trovi ju yirisin ani drobaking awatang yirisin and lam the drobaking awatang. Ani lamja sekala an kala saya lamja sebe ani dunga pewa shino setata jindi petipetata imare.
So the example for this is like a person who's traveling on a long journey. As the day goes on, as days go on, as the journey proceeds, they get more and more fatigued, and then as the provisions that they have for the journey are exhausted, the suffering of the journey increases.
Oh yeah, that didn't. But on the Shabak, Gunzan Tena, and the Gunzan Te, Ludunga Rashi in Batala, and the Joakaba Yoate. Dunga Juni, Jumabo, Nanam, Tanshan, Najubas, Nanam, Shan. Tenny to Minam like David Judah, Namain, or Tigita, Ludunga Rashi, David G, Jesu Yebe, and the Joa Misha, Shena.
So this leads to the next point that that being the case, that it's suitable to generate aversion towards one's body because it has a suffering nature to it. The body's very nature is suffering, therefore it's proper, it's suitable to give rise to aversion to it. This is explained in the 36th verse. There seem to be many causes of suffering, like sickness and so forth, and others, but humans do not have as many causes of pleasure. Now, someone might object and say, well, even though it is the case that the nature of the body is to suffer, that it's possible to alleviate that suffering by using some source of happiness. So there's no need to have that kind of aversion towards the body, if you say that.
Oh, yeah. 아니 마음보대세 라 내남 타나 현나나 동아지 주마보 단 류진에리 시제자시다 비리 돈다 깨주 난게 마보 줘라 어디가 류대 난게 류대라 동아지 주마보대 난게 깨내리 시제자시다 치가 치견신 치견 마보 주와 이라 시간 내남단자 내남탕당 타현나 주바 마음보대 나게 깨네 그저 좋아해라 대니 돈이 민남라 대위 교다 나와 많이 비셔서 오다 동아집에 주 태나신게 아니 대화집에 주다 나와 많이 비셔.
So this kind of thinking is irrational, is incorrect, because this body, the body that we possess, has many causes of suffering. There are lots of causes of suffering in the body for physical suffering. There are internal conditions such as sickness. There's enumerated 84,000 kinds of sickness that can occur within the body, and then there are external causes and conditions that can give rise to suffering, physical suffering for us as well. And if we observe these various conditions that give rise to physical suffering, we can see that there's, for human beings, there's nothing like that many causes of happiness or pleasure.
Oh, yeah. 나 대니 동안 정말 처음에 좋아 찾고서 다티 혼자 셰브 동안 먼저 아니 다 지단 동안 주단 동안 개라서 마부지와 다든서 마삼바기 관에 아니 좋아 찾고 그래서 빼나 자유 보모랑게 kim답라 텐도 예외 동안 마부단 저와 신호세
We should, thus, that being the case, we ought to develop this aversion towards the physical suffering because it arises continuously within us. The example that illustrates this is there was a man who sought a princess as his own wife, and he strove to acquire the princess as his wife, but as a result of that, he encountered all kinds of suffering.
Oh yeah, that's it. That's what the one and by your Gabatella. Sigana. Anita Casore, such a good sour condition in Aya. Ani Dunga Chichiavala, there were no was a mado, Rashiji, there was a meba in Zang. Anita, there were answered by your Gabatella, Tanga to Shagwari. Dunga answered by your young, Rangitani, there were maybe. Dunga answered by your young. 랑기찬이지 대화매바 땀바탕 동안 대화를 전부 친지로도 땀바탕 셴바 소라 대화 란잔바 탕보네 매바탕 셴바 소라 다가 셴바라서 지된바 남 동안 치치위 초와심발라 대화 란잔바 셴바탕 대화 란잔바 매비 군자 차두스다 저장아두자 다 탕보 동아 란잔바 외장 랑기 천이지 랑심에바 담바니 대화 주세 폐와 동아 란잔비 대화 연바 미주비 군잔당 동아 란잔비 집이 주유장 대화 란잔비 주메비 주메바호 다 담보 대화 주세 폐와 동아 란잔비 미주비 군잔됐다.
So this leads to the next topic, which is a refutation of the notion that there is real pleasure or happiness, real pleasure or happiness, samsaric. pleasure and happiness, that it's real pleasure or happiness. This has multiple subdivisions, the subdivisions of the text that are laid out in detail in the back of the translation. But the first is that that although there's actual suffering, there's no real happiness that meets the definition of happiness. There's no happiness that actually coincides with the real happiness, or happiness as one would define it. And that in turn has multiple subdivisions. The first of these is that by seeing, even though we see that some sort of pleasure, a little bit of it develops, that doesn't serve as reason to be able to establish that it's actual happiness, real happiness. And so this point is expressed in the next verse 37, that even though we see sometimes a little bit of pleasure arising, that development of a little bit of pleasure in our bodies, in our lives, is not sufficient reason to establish that there's real, actual happiness or pleasure.
Oh yeah, that's humble. The what you said, Pewa Toa, Ranza Bitawa Yaba, Mutubi Juntella, Pishing by Dawa Le. And it's Sitan Doba Tonjuba, Teta Dunga Pishing La Doba Yaba Maino, said that to you to go. Kadi Dewa Mena, and the Dewa Pewa Miribala, Dewa Pewa Tongi Chiri, and Moniji Dewa Yoare, Senashiji Dewa Yodo Sena.
So someone might think, well, even if there's no happiness, no pleasure, then it would be improper to say that it increases. But since we've seen the increase of pleasure, then there has to be a pleasure or happiness that exists intrinsically, that exists by means of its own, its very nature, natural, real happiness or pleasure. And that's rejected in the verse 37. With the intensification of pleasure, its opposite is seen to occur. With the intensification of pain or suffering, there will not likewise be its opposite. That is, pleasure will not arise.
Oh yeah. Patient by Dewa left, Corner Condo patient been Dewa le, Serva, Dewa le, Sidan Doba, and Dunga, patient by Sidan Doba, Dunga Junga, Tonga Jua Tatar, say, Dunga da, Cousin Doata, Dubata, Chabata, Yawata, Sir, and it can't damn Tendel and Dewa Chonga day, and draw Chabaki, Dunga Chibala, and then the other one was a motto, Colarashi, there was your mares. Colarashi, there was Yena, and it takes them down, and it there was your gola, Meba, and it don't go or Jua in town. This is what Fishing by Dewala, Sitan Doba said. O dita larina la suana sincheni sidan doba ko dunga chiche bala ani dewarangba o dewarangba zamado kola ranshi na ko chizam tenjang ani dewi ranshi jogo temeba dunga jenashi do yoba inza dunga chiche bala dewarangba mato ranshi ji dewa zawani wa mari seza Fishing by dewala sidan doba o Dungaji ju chidam damba tela dungaji rangshin le ane kola toba zani meba. Meiza chi peshin ba yu dewa la chida toba tongju ba. Chida dunga peshin le toba iba mayi no se gala dungaji ju chidam tenjang ane dunga peshin ba le tar deyungo bashik juba zawani meba. Dewi ju tanda di sajar ku chawan dewa tada ku ju chidam tembe ani dunga chicheba dunga chudu chimbala dewa rangwa ba zamado rangshin ji dewa yuwa ma rangshin ji dewa yana ku chidam tenja dunga dewa yuwa la temeba dunga ki rangshin du ju chirase layang an dana dunga ki rangshin du ju chirase dosungu duwa
la
Peshin bai dewa la Dover Chua Tetas, 와 패신바에 더서나 하고서 패신바에 세가라 배나 조차비 동아 패신바에 조차비 동아와테 데바티사나 데바 아니 데바 지고 데바 레와테 조차비 동아티 칠지어발라 데바랑 뭐바자 마도 아니 텔라 데바랑 젬바지와 마레스 是吧 대화랑 전바지나 치다 대장 대위 안에 대화 연구래 안에 대화 연말이야 동안 그라신 주고래 피신바이 대화라 시단 도바스 그래서
조탁배 동아
조탁바스 말에 조탁바스 말에 동아 칠지어 발라 동아 치우도 쳐발라 대화랑 원바 是吧 所以동아 치지어 발라 안 대화랑 원바 세라 롱지어 바기 또위 제위 동아 치지어 발라 대화랑 원바 차위 동아 치지어 발라 대화랑 원바지 마도 랑시지 대화지 와 말에 是吧 제위 동아데 세라 때네 치지어 발라 아니고 대화랑 원바자 마도 세산에 제위 동아 안 세디 강라 아니 세 치점 된장 세나 아니 대위랑 신바 동아지 하신 쪽으로 와 어떤들 패신바이 대화라 도바 주와 대라 도바 요아레 대화 치치바라 동아가 마도 랑시지 대화 지와 마레스 다 동아지 주대 치점 된장 동아지 랑신래 대용으로 저 주와 요 마레스
So the argument here is that there's no real pleasure to be found in samsara. Worldly pleasure is not real pleasure, whereas there is real suffering that we can find within we experience within our lives. And the evidence for that is that if when we examine how pleasure works, if we indulge in pleasure more and more and more, it will transform into its opposite. It will become suffering. That is, for example, when we eat food, if we when we first start eating, we experience a temporary feeling of pleasure at that sensation. But as we eat, that pleasure disappears, and if we keep eating longer and longer, the more we indulge in that sensation, then the sensation transforms into its opposite and actually it turns into suffering. Suffering, on the other hand, there is real suffering because when we engage in suffering activities, when pain is inflicted upon us, the more that pain is inflicted and that experience continues, then the suffering continues to expand, to increase more and more. So worldly pleasure is not commensurate with suffering, in that this worldly pleasure, by its very nature, because it's contaminated and is misunderstood, it transforms into its opposite. So the example here is that, or the way it's explained in the commentary, is that when a pleasurable experience that we're undergoing is indulged in and increases more and more, that sensation, we can observe that it transforms into its opposite. It becomes suffering. We can actually see that ourselves. But it's not the case that suffering, the increase of suffering operates in the same way. That is, suffering can increase more and more and more as we engage in with the objects and the activities that give rise to suffering. So therefore, when we observe the way samsaric contaminated pleasure operates, we see that it's not at the end of the process. It's not included within real pleasure. Whereas, Lusam Shintu Dongorgiola, there were power Dongogi Dubayino.
Dunga Pena, Lusam Shintu Donga Julas. Dunga Pena, Luda Semiga Shintu Donga Julas. Dunga Chisam Pewaji, Dunga Jirashin Korama, Deung or Joy on Maris.
So when suffering increases, on the other hand, we can observe that our bodies and our minds are extremely tormented, and that this whereas in the at the end of the increase of nominally called pleasure, contaminated pleasure, what we end up with is something which is included within suffering. So this worldly pleasure is nominally called pleasure, but that's due to a kind of exaggeration of its status and misconstruing what it actually is. Whereas in reality, it's included within, it's part of suffering, but we misconceive it as if it was pleasure.
인자 대화 배비 탈 동아지 두바이 노세가라 제비 동아 세비 주 아니 세라 소와 대화 배비 주 치점 땜비 탈라 아니 탈 동아지 라시마도 명인 바래 와 세세 차비 동아 연구로와 대화 배비 타 세가라 제비 동아 세비 대화 배비 대화 배비 주 치점 땜비 탈라 아니 동아지 두바르마도 대용어 줘매봐.
So the reasoning here is that we can observe this, like with, again, the example of food. We eat food, initially the cause of that pleasure, the contaminated pleasure that we're experiencing is the food, but the more we indulge in that cause, which has given rise to it, then the sensation transforms into its opposite, suffering. At the end of it, as it increases more and more, the pleasurable sensation transforms into, becomes the contrary of it, which is ordinary suffering that everyone recognizes.
Oh yeah, that deep better than Namji Suadere. Jaji then Che Junani, Ledger Wangi Chia Satin Hung. Kolu Joani to Junani Kowata, Yanjani to Tung, said a Shivi Sobanashi. Javong Alo Ni Ani Suzasunga Jaji Dan Chelawawa. 切往我穷我这他们提没什么单，俺那个干长长嘛往对你，俺那他妈猪包给，俺那他嘛。 那我妈了，东安那些现在人送过来，他叫我了那家亲戚带去对吧？我都东安西弄。
So an example that's given for this is King Mandatar, who is one of the previous births of Lord Buddha before he achieved Buddhahood or before he became a full bodhisattva. He was born as this universal emperor who controlled the entirety of the world, but he envied the power of Indra, God Indra, who ruled over, even above him, over the world of the heaven of the 33 above him. And so out of his desire to achieve that even greater power than being a universal emperor, he strove to achieve that throne of Indra, and as a result of that fell down into a lower state of existence, fell into hell.
对吧？叫我俺了，你说吧，叫我俺了，你家去一点去对吧？得钱。但是呢，东岸让咱把机会就业讲，对吧？让咱把机会就买吧。他对了，简单的天气对吧？来多把汤给东岸啦，简单天气对吧？来多把汤给东岸啦，简单面的天气就多把也把没弄，是他得送多。你们就开始说单场呢。 对吧？让给最简单，对吧？让给简单，现在对吧？了多吧，东岸把些都统计，东岸啦是简单，现在对吧？了多吧统计东岸啦是，他就俺让子写把那些简的，对不就开始单场呢？对吧？让给简单，现在对吧？了多吧，对吧？明白？俺的东岸把些都统计。 统计把些情况统计东岸啦，是吧？这那么一张天气都多把一把没弄是体决定了，东岸去见那么当，东岸去见那么他当，天气多把掉的，天气多把掉的就话一把没弄是都。 东岸人多的，到了去吧，要把马来西亚东岸去住的，但那东岸去建那么当，俺那天气都多吧，俺到了去吧，要把去马来，是建那么一当天气都多吧，要把马来弄。
So this leads to the next point, which is that although there are causes which give rise to real, actual suffering, there's no cause which gives rise to real, actual pleasure or happiness. This is in verse 38, which says, with the conditions for pleasure, its opposite is seen. With the conditions for pain, there is not its opposite. And this is explained in the commentary. When one overindulges in the causes of pleasure, such as food and so forth, the opposite of pleasure, just pain, is seen to occur. Together, it occurs together with those conditions for pleasure. But when one has prolonged contact with the causes of pain, together with these conditions for pain, there's no change into pleasure, which is the opposite of that suffering that or pain that one's undergoing.
Oh yeah, that did it better lah. Jauh yang I meji, cerah nyaman kawa, cerah nyaman kawa seso, tambo. Rang kang gawa ki ane jalam chedu chene, rang ki daba yoba ki jalam chedu chune. Tene jalam shen tenpa mebe, tene yang jalam shen tenpa mebe chi dunga chunga shino. Tampo rang ki gawa ki jalam chedu chu. Tene jalam shen tendu mebe yenbe tela dunga wa chunga shino.
The example that's given for this is during the time of King Ashoka, he had a prison which was called the Pleasant Abode, or a place of delight. And in that prison, the way it worked was that initially the person who was imprisoned was given whatever it was they desired to enjoy, and they were allowed to engage in whatever kind of pleasurable activity they wanted to, but they weren't allowed to do any other kind of behavior other than that. They were forced to indulge in that pleasure, that pleasurable activity, and not do anything else, so that at the end they became completely miserable and suffered as a result.
Oh yeah, that's it. 치신발라 대어라 샴바 동아라 대어라 템바 치지로도 담바텔라 투두다 동아라 대와 템바 치지로도 담바텔라 투체 왜 누가 동아라 치템바 치신발라 대어라 샴바 메르바당 어 메진바 제단이 신발라 대와 샴바 다다부 미든바 토마두와라 대와 샴메로 라신발라 대와 샴바 메르바당 아두지레 체신발라 대와 대와 주자지 동아지 주다마 미셔바다 대유베나나다 담보 치신발라 대와 샴바 메르바디 그러와 조기나네 담보 치신발라 대와 샴바 메르바텔라 최지 시라 뒤성시 시라 의성시나 도와타는 도주라 치신반에 대주제 남바꾼도 르마인 세우도다 데라 가르송어레스나 현지 대화단 대노 시 줘발레 레니 대화 여도 셴나 야
So the next topic is that it's the instruction or exposition of how it is that holding that which is suffering as being pleasurable is erroneous. Holding that which is in fact suffering as if it was happiness or pleasurable is erroneous. And this has multiple subdivisions. The first of which is that holding that it's incorrect to hold, to apprehend someone who's in the process of dying as if they were experiencing pleasure or happiness. And this is explained in the verse 39, where someone might say, someone, Devadatta, for example, has happiness. And because that's expressed, it's said, Devadatta is happy, then there is happiness. Someone might say that. Well, in the verse, it's explained that as follows: when you have spent, are spending, and will spend time dying, it is not at all proper to call the process of dying pleasurable.
Oh yeah, that 确实行了推送行行不着，确实送了推送行才对了。对些那么的各级基本上做建人，对些他们讲，对些那么的各级人了基本上做建人行。这样你推送了没住，但我他忙把他又推送了没住呗，去我的接近七星把那推送行是，我是哦，他这样俺能找我当找我当的，七这样俺的七张找我的去呢，70八年呢，俺70八年找我的就是些，那么更多是不骂的。
So here then, the response to that is that this kind of thinking is completely erroneous, incorrect, because created things, I'm translating duce as created things. Some people translate this as compounded things. 39, what should you do? Composite things, some people translate it. I'm translating this as duce or samskrta as created things. So created things have as their basic character the disintegration moment to moment. Everything that is created moment to moment disintegrates moment to moment, and that's their basic character. And this has been the case in the past, the present, and the future, or throughout the three times. So you, that is the person who thinks that there's real happiness, in the past you were you disintegrated and died throughout the past. You spent your entire past disintegrating and dying. Right now, you're going towards death and just dying in the process of dying in that sense. And then in the future as well, you will continue to proceed towards death. So someone who has been, is, and will be in that condition of proceeding towards death, how could it be proper to say that such a person is happy, is experiencing pleasure? It's entirely illogical, irrational, and improper.
아니 김다게 제마모 추세를 해봐. 제배 추선배 추니 해봐 미시와시 해 줘봐당. 말아 이때봐 추니 해봐 추선봐 인노 세와다르스. 세와다. 치와 남자 치신바라 대원냠도 셈소.
So the example here is that it says childish, foolish people think that while they're dying, actually, that they're happy, or that someone who's in the process of dying all the time is happy. They have that kind of thought. And the example to illustrate this is there was a bad servant who ruined all of the possessions of their master, and then the master said to them, "You ungrateful person, you're ungrateful." And the servant replied to his or her master, "You're the one who spoiled me by trusting me."
단 내심 발라 대화를 시험한 매를 받지 라는 내가 세심 발라 아니 대화 시험한 매를 많이 류전 나올라 제소지 내가 다도 예춘나 내심 반이 대오시 나바 군도 르마인 어디 가려서 그래서나 시야 동안라 대화를 시험받이 르그 말레스 매를 받게래서 류전 나올라 这话当光把送去，那把大队也别切了，是旅监拿了这说去，那把大队也去拿，是哦。这话当光把送去，那把大队也把去拿，东岸局内心把他了，俺你对我说，那把工作是不骂的，是哦。内心把你对我说，那把工作是骂人。
So the second point in this topic is that it's incorrect or improper to apprehend someone who is undergoing harm, who's being harmed, as if they were happy or experiencing pleasure. And the verse here explains that that embodied beings are constantly undergoing the injury of hunger, thirst, and so forth, and it's entirely improper to say that someone who is being harmed in that way is happy. Then the commentary says that it's improper to consider that someone who is suffering is happy or experiencing pleasure. Embodied beings are constantly undergoing the injury of hunger, thirst, and so forth. And it's entirely improper to consider those who are undergoing that kind of injury out of these causes of suffering, lack of food and drink and so forth, being thirsty and hungry and so forth, to be happy. To say that they're happy is completely illogical.
Oh yeah, that nama kachi. Anade nama sikara sore chimna pa nama chimpa serta ra chimta chen nama kachi. Chimji wang ten de nyewe. Ani chimji ani jingyon wang这卡子两个钱现在他哦，今就往的团队年外，经常钱的团队年外贴钱呗，都让我抽奖。So an
example to illustrate this is if you take the case of a new wife, a second wife, but she's the new wife, and she really wanted to take control of the household, and she got that. She took control of it, but experienced a great deal of misery as a result of that. But at the same time, she pretended to be happy.
Oh yeah, that's that will medium but too much do a lot. On the other hand, Mirubani Niva Meba Jungo and La Soba Sheja Jejudes. Niva Meba Jungo and La Soba Sheja Jejude. Gawa Namlan Devo Namakundu Miruse, what that did. Oh, Niva Meba Jungo La Segana, Jushi Karu Rela, Sadan Chuda Meta Lungi, Jushi Karu Rela, Rang Lutuboki Niva Mebe. Junga Gula de. 초바라 뉴시 아니 저와 주그레세 초바 세자 제주데스 초바 세자 제주데스 롱기 와서데 뭐중아 주체 롱기 샤남 타러와당 다 롱중아 소소기 롱기 요와당 메스 아니 식바당 去干巴当，安尼反正那把车把去修把人啦，就我可能马这把给不，安尼就是马这把呢，安尼就好让个进来那把修把人啦，反正每天先就我搞把错把台啦，错把台啦，安尼对话嘞是个绿个，安尼就。绿级大西就我错把台啦，对我些，安尼那么更多没人开是。
The next verse shows then that the body is really just a collection of various sort of things which are actually discordant and are almost like enemies to one another. And therefore, it's improper to misapprehend, to grasp at the body as being a source of pleasure, as being pleasurable. The verse here is verse 41, which says that although powerless, the combining of all the elements produces the body. Thus, it is not at all proper to call that which is incompatible pleasurable. So each of the individual elements, there are 4 elements, earth, water, wind, fire, and each of them together, or individually, each of the individual 4 elements doesn't have any ability to produce our bodies. Rather, it's in dependence upon all of the elements together in a collection that we designate something as a body, as our body, And it arises, the so-called body arises from this collection, combination of all of the elements together. But when we examine it carefully, the wind element has the power to disperse all of the other elements. The fire element, it scorches the earth element, and it dries up the wind element. So these elements individually are, in fact, can operate so as to harm each other. And they do, in fact, operate that way at times. So something which is composed of a bunch of discordant elements, things that are discordant with one another and actually are contrary to each other, calling a collection of that as happiness is completely irrational, is improper.
Oh yeah, that is better. 变那大党结账的，主党到家党，李大党出身起哇，所以讲初步的先就的对完了。
So the example that's given for this is, it's like if you bring together a collection of animals, a jackal, snake, bird, a deer, together with a crocodile which devours children, these 6 animals, you put them together in a single place, there's not going to be any pleasure to be found there.
Oh yeah. 希望老心把那台湾先把每日把你。 场所那么了七七八，大队要把马印呐，拉新把印的话，我些那么更多人马印是，我这个看着也是，那场所那么了是差七七八是，那旅行那长瓦堂，长瓦那么了七七月塔是，大家长长瓦堂长于东啊七七月塔，冬天大队要把马印呐是，冬天的话大队要把马印呐。 So the
next point is that it's improper, incorrect to misapprehend, to grasp at that which is being destroyed as if it was happiness. And this is given in verse 42, where it says, when there is never that which will relieve cold and so forth, it is not at all proper to call that which is being destroyed as pleasurable or happiness. So embodied beings, beings that have bodies, when beings with bodies never have effective means to do away with cold, heat, and so forth, it is not at all proper to call these beings that are being destroyed by harmful agents as possessing happiness, as being happy.
Oh yeah. 他提别的啦，下巴到右巴经济，你两把的台湾，但是话台湾给公布了台湾把信号，
Example that's given is if you have robbers that are being chased and harassed with nooses and sticks by others, then they never have any happiness at all.
Oh, 当我都记得。 切心把那台湾先把美日把呢，别说没有把就把些，查高阳山顶原民呐，查把高阳那像那些台湾一弄些，那么更多美日说，那这个看来说看个几点呢？海鲜台湾人家都协议，他年月呗，台湾人咱把越多些呐，海鲜到我俺那台湾人家都协议，俺那他年月把人上，台湾人咱把越多些呐。
So the next verse says that it's completely improper to conceive of someone who is undergoing fatiguing work as if they were happy. And you might say, well, here in the world we can see cases of like Devadatta is sleeping comfortably. He's sleeping peacefully and happily. And that sort of convention is employed. So therefore there is real happiness, real pleasure to be found. The verse here replies to that. Verse 43 says, when in the world there's no action is done without exertion, it is not at all proper to call performing actions pleasurable, or you could say like doing work as being pleasurable.
Oh yeah. 别做没有把脚把鞋查个， chawa kayang cha kayang sa ting yu min na sa de li sim ji ba so me ba nya wa dang zhuo wa dang du ba la se be che ba xie cha wa de ani kayang ani sa ting de na yu ba min na是吧？让心机的话也呢，俺你娘问，有啊的话让咱把去也呢，俺你别做了嘛，对吧？用让咱把用苦果送给人家，我都起来切心吧了，的话有的是那么更多没人说。
So here, the reason that the reply to that is that here, for worldly beings, there's never a case that if we look just here on Earth, in our own world, we try to observe when we observe behavior. Behavior is something which is always behavior such as lying down or going along, walking, sitting. All of these kinds of so-called behaviors are never done without some kind of effort of body or mind. And that being the case, it's completely inappropriate to say that someone who is engaged in fatiguing work, engaging in activities that tire one out, is in a state of happiness. So example that's given to illustrate this is like a prince who is always harassed by his teachers. He has 5 teachers who teach him grammar and so forth, and or grammar or poetics, these sort of topics, and he's always being harassed by them, so he's always miserable.
동아지 주주발라 대화를 샴바 메리바니 대화 중세 좀 전도 대단 현도 당연히 다도 들래 송화차 안로연나 대화시 남바근도 르마이 세르가 아니 대화 맨나 대위 텐도 동아녀와 미대발라 아니 대화 주비치도 동아녀와 통해 아니 대화 여도 세나
So then the next point is that it's improper to apprehend as pleasurable that which in fact is producing the causes of suffering, even if you do it for the sake of a little bit of so-called pleasure or happiness. And this is explained in verse 44, where it says, "In this life and others, always one should guard against ill deeds." She's ill deeds or negative actions. Calling them pleasurable is not at all proper when there are bad rebirths. When they produce bad rebirths. So then someone might say, well, if there's no happiness, then it would be improper to experience suffering for the sake of happiness. And therefore, since we see that people undergo suffering in order to accomplish happiness, there actually is happiness.
Oh yeah, I 가서 그래. 랑도 지내라 미가봐. 대화 중세지기 전도양彻底 대화 중세 잠이 전도양 대바 제배 아니彻底당彻底를 치워서당 치망한지 동안 영화 교회 생활로 영화 교회 개원 남지 대화 대배 아니 개원 남지 아니 대화 대배 彻底당 현도 아니 대당 현도 당연히彻底당 현도 당연히 다도 리비 규제지 있어 리비 규제지 선을 대우를 권해 리비 대우 동안에 송화차 거에 다도 들래 송화차세요 리비 대우 동안에 송화차 거에 미가 왜 대위 텐도 미게베 대위 텐도 레셰비 대우 안조연아 대란 대화시 안에 나바 군도 안에 가서래 나바 군도를 봐 말해
So then the reply to that is that that those who are unwise for the sake of a little bit of so-called pleasure, engage in negative activities, ill deeds or sinful actions. And here, in this life, they die. These negative actions can produce death in the present, and in the future as well, they've experienced the suffering of going into the evil destinies, the lower states of rebirth. Therefore, those who are wise, who understand things properly, since they desire happiness, they ought to constantly guard themselves from the suffering which has as its cause all of the different kinds of negative actions, and so they need to protect themselves both here in this life, the happiness to produce happiness in this life, as well as in their other lives in the future as well, by protecting themselves from suffering which has as its source negative actions. So that being the case, the unskillful or unwise person engages in actions that, for the sake of happiness, which have as their result suffering of the lower realms, and calling that happiness, that is those negative actions which produce the sufferings of the lower realms, is entirely improper.
Oh yeah, that is better. Mazo jubi dala. 大都几把九万七星图，马做马西巴就别占了，大都几把九万七星图，当然讲，俺那地边来了，话说地边来，俺那送我去过来，才这我俺送的。
So the example that illustrates this is that we really need to protect ourselves from negative actions, just as we fear an enemy that we're not aware of, but we know that is out there and is active.
他想把老说话，对吧？让咱把没把你，想把老说话了，对吧？让咱把汤不能没把你，想把老说闽南籍大队对吧？原名的汤不看了做没把他了，特别看了有是对吧？天多年完了，刚把你去找完了，东岸米呢，找完了东岸米呢，俺这大浪不行，当大浪不了，想把汤完，对吧？越多钱呐，对吧？越多钱呐。
So then, next point is that there's no real that 45. Come on. That things like riding on conveyances are not real happiness, even from the very start. That's illustrated in the next verse, verse 45. There is never any pleasure for humans in riding and so forth. How can that which at the very beginning, at the start does not begin, in the end increase? So someone might say that one sees that those intent on pleasure ride horses and elephants, considering it a discomfort to walk on their own 2 feet. Therefore, pleasure does actually exist.
Oh yeah, they do Deba Teta, Tata Lambo Chimbala saw tongue, Deba Teta, JBC, Tambone, and Casore. Kandango Drovang Ave, and the Tata Lambo Shembe, and Dunga Chungu Zamba, Tajina Shit, Dunga Chungu Zamba, Dunga Chung the Chumbala, Darangamatam, that nothing but it. Dunga Chungu Zamba Yindi, Shemba Tang, Sadula Long Javas and Minamji Deva Tambona Tatuba Mares, Marti Dunga di Chirichavala, and a Darangamatamado, Tambona Tatu Deva Mares. 만인데 하바잖아 동아 바시 시우스 안에 따라 시시시잖아 양 동아 지당 세사사잖아 동아 그라신 쪽으로 하바잖아 동아 바시도 주위치로
So this is incorrect because on examining accepted causes of pleasure, one finds that right from the start, slight discomfort is beginning. For humans, there is never, even at the outset, pleasure in riding, eating, or drinking. If done in excess, they only become painful. So here it says that, for example, if one starts off and riding a horse or whatever, at the beginning you think, oh, this is pleasant. But if it was really pleasurable, if it was actual pleasure, then the more you did it, the pleasure would continue to increase more and more. But if we see that if we ride for longer and longer, as the time goes on, what was thought to be pleasurable actually changes into suffering. And as one continues more and more, the suffering increases even greater. The same thing applies to overindulging in food.
Oh yeah. There's a Tambona Kana Tunga Zoba Meba Tela, Tatunga Chimpewa Jungo Maris. Tambona, ne, Tunga Chungu Zambatella, and the Devara Shambaris, Devara Shamba. Penatu Limbo Ship, Pame, Kuru, Gaji, Davis, Kuru, Jawasi, Jusamashino, say.
So then, how could something which at the start was not a beginning of pain in the end increase and become intense pain? That which from the start was a small incipient cause of pain is actually mistaken for pleasure. And then the example that illustrates this is like a fool who thinks that the last half ladle of his parents' fried bread will actually satisfy his hunger.
Oh, yeah,
Stop there.